Our next panelist is Harold D. Truller. He's a consultant of the issue of faith and families with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And Mr. Truller is going to share with you the pilot program, faith-based pilot program he's currently working with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Mr. Truller.
Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. And I want to thank you and the Congressman for this invitation and for partnering with the Casey Foundation, which is one of the co-sponsors of this event. The Annie E. Casey Foundation is headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland, and was the brainchild of Jim Casey. He named the foundation for his mother, who raised him as a single mother. And when he and his brother formed their small messenger business, you may have heard of it, it's called UPS. They determined that they would use the proceeds from that business for philanthropic purposes. Thank you. To assist children who didn't have the breaks that they had, being raised by a courageous single mother. In the work of the Casey Foundation, one of the issues that has come to our attention has been prisoner reentry and reintegration. And we use both terms because we distinguish between reentry and reintegration in this manner. Reentry is a fact. Everybody comes back just about. Reintegration, however, is the goal that we strive for when people do return. And so we tend to use the term reintegration to talk about the goals that we set in this kind of work at the Casey Foundation. Specifically within the foundation, we work in three areas in reentry. We're working on economic opportunities. We're working also on dealing with legislation to deal with collateral sanctions. That's the issues that face men and women once they come out, both in terms of housing and jobs, etc. And then also we're working with the faith community because we believe that the faith community has a distinct opportunity and brings a distinct set of resources to women and men returning from incarceration and their families. Specifically in consultation with a number of faith leaders, civic leaders, and we use the term returning citizens. My friend Lonnie McLeod, who was a student of mine when I taught at Sing Sing Prison, always talks about the fact that whenever someone calls him an ex-offender, he says, "You're defining me in terms of my past. You're defining me in terms of my worst moment. You're not defining me in terms of what I was." He says, "Define me in terms of what I am." And so we used, at Casey, we use the term returning citizen. In working with returning citizens, what we've been able to do is to tap into not just working with the citizen himself or herself, but also around the issues of family. Because every individual that is incarcerated has family members that are back in the community. In fact, some people estimate that every inmate carries with him or her another 14 individuals who are affected directly by his or her incarceration. The faith community can bring very, very specific resources to the table. And in working with the faith community and working with these returning citizens and in our consultation, we wanted to find out, was there something that any church could do, not just the big steeple churches that have their own 501c3 and community development corporation, but is there a way in which the rank and file of congregations could get involved in this kind of work? And what we were able to develop, myself, Dr. Robert Franklin from Morehouse College, and Stephanie Boddy from the Pew Forum, as a result of these conversations, is an initiative called Healing Communities. Healing Communities works with congregations across the country, helping them develop pastoral care resources and relationship building for returning citizens and their families. It's basically an initiative that focuses on the relationship context of the reentry process rather than on jobs or on housing. Eugene Williams, who we work with in Los Angeles, likes to say that if you put up new housing on one side of the street and you give me a job on the other side of the street, if I don't work on building relationships and changing the social fabric of a community, I can get shot crossing the street. And so we believe that whereas we're real clear, and all the research shows that employment and housing are critical, not every congregation, not every mosque, not every house of worship can do transitional housing. They can't all do job training or jobs creation, but they can all build relationships. And so we are working right now with the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which has adopted this model of relationship building as their official prison ministry model for their churches across the country. This week, the United Church of Christ here in the city of Washington has agreed to adopt this model. We're working with the Kingdom Care Reentry Network in Philadelphia, also with several groups in Indianapolis, Providence, and other cities to help congregations to do this kind of work. We've developed a handbook that the congregations are using in the PNBC. It's available on their website. The Progressive Baptist Convention's website is www.pnbc.org. And if you go to their website and click on prison ministry, the PDF of their handbook on reentry ministry is available there at no charge. What we focus on in the handbook are 7 basic things that we believe any congregation can do. And we're seeing congregations in the pilot cities for PNBC of Detroit. We have 40 churches in Detroit doing this work. We have 7 churches in Richmond doing this work and 5 in Houston that are doing this work for PNBC. And they focus on 7 issues. The first issue they focus on is what we call stigma reduction. The idea that the congregation ought to be a safe space for people to talk about the fact that they have someone in their family that is locked up. The reality is that all of our churches have someone who has a family member that's incarcerated. And most of our churches have such a silence on the issue that these people who carry this burden aren't able to talk even in their church, even when they give their testimony about their son, their father, their husband, their daughter, their mother who is currently incarcerated. And so we've developed resources for congregations to help to break the stigma, help to break the shame, sermon resources, Bible study resources, testimony resources. We are encouraging congregations to bring women and men who have criminal records to speak with them. We've identified pastors across the country who have criminal records. I have a criminal record. I'm still on probation. And I'll share my story, or other people share their stories, so that we can give returning citizens a face. And church people are motivated more so by stories than they are by statistics. And so by telling the stories and giving the testimonies, one woman was a marvelous testimony. We had in Brooklyn, New York, at Emmanuel Baptist Church. We were launching a reentry program there, and she got up to give her testimony. She was a senior citizen, a church mother. She had her little church mother button on, with little tags on the back. And she got up to talk, and we thought she was going to talk about her grandson. And she said, 40 years ago, you all didn't know me. I was married then, and I found out that my husband was having a relationship with a woman that was not biblically sanctioned. And I decided that the best way to end that relationship was to burn down her house with her in it. She said, I did burn the house down. She was not killed, but I was charged with arson and attempted murder, and I did time in Bedford, which is the women's correctional facility in New York State. She said it was the church that was there to meet me when I came out and help me get back on my feet. And the reason that you see me here today is because the church wrapped its arms around me. And at that moment, we didn't even have to give a sermon or anything. People were ready to begin to get involved in this work because they saw the story of someone who had made the successful transition from incarceration back into the community. So we work on reducing stigma. The second issue we work on is having the congregations identify a family in their church that is currently affected by incarceration. One of the things that a lot of churches do is they start outreaches to prisons, they start outreaches to jails, and they step on their way to go to the jail or on their way to go to the prison, they step over a family in their own church, in their own mosque, in their own temple. When I was a pastor, I once gave an altar call to ask anyone who has someone who's incarcerated, please raise your hand, we want you to come forward and pray. And half the church was up front. And so beginning with our own congregations by lifting the stigma and beginning to walk alongside those families that we have in our own congregations is the second issue that we raise with the congregations. The third thing we do is that we create support networks. We're trying to build relationships, not provide a service. Not every church has the capacity to do solid service provision, but every congregation has the capacity to do relationship building. And so we want people who will walk with a family, who will walk with an inmate, will walk with a returning citizen, will be someone that can help, can drive them to to a facility for a visit, or someone that they can just talk with. It's providing those kinds of basic support services, support networks that all people need in the returning process and that families need while they're under the pressure of having their loved one incarcerated. The fourth thing we do is we encourage them to support the family in its work and visitation. One of the things that the congregations are doing is they're providing rides for women and men who want to visit family members that are locked up. I've made the observation in writing that every church van represents 15 people who won't give somebody a ride home. The reality is that most church vans aren't used for anything but picking up people to and from church, and so we're trying to give people the opportunity to use church vans in order to provide transportation to and from facilities and to facilitate the visitation process. The fifth issue is volunteer development. We're trying to get congregations to do different kinds of volunteer work besides Bible studies and giving a church service, helping them work in literacy issues, fatherhood issues, things like that. The sixth issue is referral networks. We're having congregations set up with other agencies so that if people need a job or they need housing, they'll be able to find a place where that can happen if the church can't provide it themselves. And then the final issue is giving them information on policy advocacy so that they can be advocates for women and men returning from incarceration. Thank you.
When you arrived with your agenda, you should have received a copy of the report entitled Restoration, Reestablishing the African Americans and Their Families, African American Families and Their Communities. And the Annie E. Casey, as well as the Urban Institute, was very instrumental in his underwriting of that and contributing editors. A lot of these statistics and barriers that are being discussed on the panel you will find within the report. Our next guest panelist is Mr. Rodney C. Mitchell, the Director of Ex-Offenders Affairs with Mayor Fenty's office. And he's going to discuss the challenges in servicing the formerly incarcerated in the D.C. area, as well as Mayor Fenty's vision for a range of wraparound services. Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. I'm just so honored to be here today on behalf of Mayor Adrian Fenty. And I want to thank Congressman Danny Davis. I've been attending these forums for many years. I'm honored to participate in this forum and to contribute to this critical discussion, addressing the issues, challenges, and triumphs of citizens returning to the community after incarceration. My name is Rodney Mitchell. I am the Director in the Office of Ex-Offender Affairs for the District of Columbia, and I want to welcome the visitors to D.C. Enjoy our fair city. We consider ourselves technicians over in my shop. We have a multiplicity of tasks that we do. We see men and women who have been home for 20 years. We see men and women who come home the first day after doing 35, 40 years in prison. We consider ourselves having boots on the ground, so to speak. We consider ourselves real soldiers out there. We're over in Southeast D.C., across from the Big Chair. Anybody knows about Anacostia? You know, that's a tough part of the city. But we enjoy our work, not so much because, you know, it's what we love to do, because we see the success stories. We see people transforming their lives and moving on beyond what's expected. I'd be remiss if I didn't share that I'm also an ex-offender. I've been in the streets since I was 11 years old. I'm from Southeast D.C., but I went to South Central and continued my life of crime as a young man. I don't have to give you the details. I think there's been enough stories here to kind of give a general idea of what goes on out there. I was one of those products of the 80s as well. I was drinking, drugging, thugging, doing all that, gang banging, you just name it, all the INGs, I was doing it. I spent time, many days and nights, Christmases, birthdays, and the institutions of California and the county jails of Los Angeles County, and, you know, back here in D.C., you know, what we call Central Cell Block and all those good places. And what I want to do this time is kind of share. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the technical, aspects of this work, and that's very important to know, because this is work that needs that kind of care and attention. It's an exact science in some sense. It needs the same kind of sociological studies and social science studies that happens. I was fortunate. I was very fortunate. I had a mother and a grandmother that did a lot of praying for me. I'm not a Bible thumper, but I know something was going on beyond what I could do to pull me out of that rut I was in. I was fortunate. I paroled back in 1992. I went to a junior college in California. I mopped floors and cleaned toilets at night. On my breaks, I studied basic English and math. I graduated from a high school in D.C., but I came out reading the 9th grade level. I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to UC Berkeley as an undergrad. I finished that program studying African American studies and public policy. I wanted to find out what was going on with my folks. I was dying to come back to D.C. I applied to law school. I got into George Washington Law, finished that program in 2002, passed the bar. Thank you. And quite frankly, immediately went to work doing this. But I had my first foray into reentry work. My younger brother was released back in 1998. He was doing a life sentence at a California correctional facility for a crime he didn't commit. Forward his case all the way through the California courts, got into the Ninth Circuit, it was overturned. He came home that spring. And so, he was quite a young man, because he met a lot of friends while he was doing that time. And so our apartment on UC Berkeley campus, family housing, turned into kind of Grand Central for the California state system. We were taking collect calls day in, day and night. I mean, it was no stop to the calls. How'd you do it? I'm coming home. What do I do? What do I do? So my reentry work started right there on UC Berkeley's family housing campus. Myself, my brother, and my daughter. I sometimes find it useful to organize this very broad and expansive topic of prisoner reintegration by breaking it out and examining the rights and responsibilities of all relevant parties and stakeholders. From my perspective, the party who has the most to lose is a returning resident, whose very life and liberty hangs in the balance as they attempt to successfully transition from incarceration to liberty. A return trip to prison is often not the only consequence of an unsuccessful reintegration. A number of unsuccessful transitions result in a closed casket, with family and community left to grieve yet another tragic senseless loss of life. My family experienced such heart-wrenching grief with the death of my younger brother, who had spent that decade in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He was killed a year later, 1999, as a direct result of a turbulent reentry. And so I want to start by talking about the responsibilities of all three parties: the returning resident or citizen, the government, and the community. But let's just start with the returning residents. And I speak this not so much because I'm, trying to outline exactly what happens, but I want to give my experience in this business. And it's been my experience that first and foremost, the returning resident must take full ownership and the primary responsibility in becoming a productive member of society. That is, we must commit to positive and productive transformation and redefine ourselves according to well-established values, principles, and norms of our families, communities, and society. Returning residents have the primary responsibility in setting the course to successful reintegration. If in the beginning it merely means having the requisite intent on doing the right thing. We can often find people in institutions that will assist us with fine-tuning our plans, goals, and objectives. However, we have to come to the table with clean hands to begin this life-altering and extremely difficult journey. Otherwise, no amount of government, private, or self-designed efforts or programs will be able to sustain persons over the course of this marathon. It will take commitment, courage, and flat-out hard work to weather all the collateral consequences, the stigma, the discrimination, the self-defeating battles that we wage within and that are waged against us while attempting to reintegrate with family and community. We have to be committed to living life on life's terms. That is, life before adversity, life after adversity, and life with adversity. Living and the quality of life must take center stage for any of this to make sense. Why do we wish to be released from incarceration? To improve the quality of life. Why do we wish to get good jobs? To increase the quality of life. Why do we wish to be clean and sober? To increase the quality of life. From my experience, as one with 17 years free of the criminal justice system, the one thing that a person must possess to stay among the living, to contend with this rough and tumble hard life that we live on these streets, is a tenacious will to live. Without courage, determination, and the will to live each day, one day at a time, we merely exist without hope and without sufficient oxygen and energy to propel us forward. What I've done is summarize some of the conversations that we have with our residents who visit our doors. And these conversations don't happen in this kind of context, but we get that message across because we're all ex-offenders, most of us in my office. And so we don't have to be politically correct. And we can tell it like it is. The government. The government has the responsibility of providing the infrastructure, the resources and information necessary to support the efforts of returning citizens attempting to successfully reintegrate. This is the vision of Mayor Adrian Fenty. The notion of reintegrating our residents must commence at the very pendency of a matter, the first signs of trouble, at the arrest stage. We cannot wait until the doors slam in the prison. It might be too late at that point. We must commence with assisting residents from the very beginning, with addressing the challenges and issues that threaten their liberty and ability to remain free of the criminal justice system. We must look at opportunities for intervention throughout the system, at the plea bargaining phase, at the pretrial phase, at the sentencing phase. If need be, our judges must hand down more individualized, relevant sentences and designate citizens to institutions where they can truly rehabilitate and return home with the needed skill to survive and thrive. We must eliminate the structural and institutional barriers to employment, certain occupations and housing. We must allow for full restoration of citizenship so that returning residents may participate and compete in the marketplace, in civic life, and in the lives of their families and communities with meaning and impact. The family and community, the third party to this endeavor. On a day-to-day basis, we rely on the goodwill of our family and neighbors to support us with the love, care, and concern that will sustain our minds, our bodies, and our spirits. In most cases, such love, care, and concern is usually delivered by family and community. However, I challenge government to step up our game and to start showing more love, more care, and more concern. Such so-called intangibles can also make the difference. In the district, 2,100 residents return every year from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. We don't have a local prison anymore. Another 19,000 to 20,000 cycle in and out of our D.C. jail. D.C. isn't that big. We have a huge problem in the district. A lot of folks are coming back, returning to their families and communities without the proper preparation to be successful. And let's be honest, without that preparation, it's very hard to compete in this job market, in this market. Community and family members must educate themselves on the stressors and pressures associated with reintegration and find ways to support those who have been out of the community and need to be socially oriented and engaged. We must learn how to travel when we come home, how to communicate, how to navigate all the systems and circumstances that those of us who've been home for a while take for granted. A simple trip uptown on the Red Line can mean a big deal for a person who's just coming home. Myself, along with hundreds and thousands of other returning residents, are very hopeful with the passing of the Second Chance Act that's been championed by Danny Davis, Congressman Danny Davis. The very title suggests that society finally gets it and embraces the principles of redemption and forgiveness. Most returning residents are remorseful. They hate that they cause a havoc amongst their families and communities, and they want a second chance. They are extremely grateful that someone will offer them an opportunity despite their past transgressions. The Second Chance Act. The Second Chance Act embodies all these principles, ideas, and values. However, we as individuals, government, and community must now commence with the requisite strategic planning process in order to have these goals come to fruition. We must methodically and deliberately comb through our current systems and processes and identify the gaps. We must concretely determine what outcomes we wish to produce and measures to indicate those outcomes and targets. We must look for the best practices. We must look for the evidence-based practices. We must truly collaborate and not duplicate services and products and not engage in hyper non-productive competition for resources and funding that undermines the very population we seek to serve. Y'all know what I'm talking about. We most importantly must infuse love, care, and concern into all our efforts and processes and see the individual human being and their families as persons and people deserving of the best we have to offer. However, at the end of the day, there are not enough programs, philanthropy, or handouts to meet the needs of the millions of returning residents. We must support more legislation and policies that will allow individuals to be self-sufficient and self-determined and be able to compete in the marketplace as fully restored, fully free, and fully independent individuals. At such time, our residents can truly call themselves fully reintegrated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodney. I also want to thank you and the mayor's office because we've been so fortunate to have the opportunity to work with Mayor Fenty and with his office in all aspects of Washington District of Columbia. I happen to be the chairman of the subcommittee that has oversight over the District of Columbia. I chair the subcommittee on what we call the Federal Workforce, District of Columbia, and Postal Service, which really means in a way that I'm kind of a liaison to the District of Columbia, given the fact that they don't have home rule yet, although I'm a serious advocate of home rule. And of course, Eleanor, they beat us on the gun bill the other week. I thought Eleanor was going to die. That's Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton, who had a different bill that we were pushing, but you know, they kind of beat us on that one in terms of saying that the Supreme Court thinks that people in Washington, D.C. ought to have guns, and people in Washington, D.C. don't think they ought to have guns, but the Supreme Court think they ought to have guns. That's very interesting. Especially is it interesting that many of our colleagues from, I told them, I said, look, now, if we were in Mississippi, I got a strange feeling you'd be telling us that we don't know what Mississippi needs or that you don't know what Indiana needs, but they know what Washington, D.C. needs. So we thank you so much for the cooperation that we've had and how much you have helped. You mentioned Second Chance, and I'll just mention one thing about it. I talked to Dave Obey the other day, and of course Dave Obey is the chairman of appropriations, all the people who be looking for money. And of course we are living now on a CR, a continuing resolution. What that really means is that we don't have an appropriated budget. That is, we haven't split up the money to go to all of the different places we hope that it will go to operate the government next year. And when you're not able to do that, you have some called a continuing resolution. What that really means is you're going to spend the same amount of money for things that you spent last year. If you only had one pan of that cake the fellow was talking about, then you only got one pan until you reallocate the money. We will probably come back, who knows, but we would expect to do some more reallocation in January, according to Dave. I also talked to Dick Durbin, my colleague from Illinois, at our delegation meeting the other day. Dick is the chairman by virtue of being the senior senator from the state. And of course, should Dick's buddy get elected president, or when Dick's buddy get elected president, then I would think that Dick Durbin would probably be the most influential member of the Senate, I would imagine. Well, Dick has assured me that he's going to do everything in his power to make sure that we get some real money for reentry. And so if you didn't have any other reason to try to make sure that Dick's buddy got elected president, that might be one reason to do it. All right. Well, you know, these things, we don't do a whole lot of different kind of partisan political activity in relationship to things that we do through the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, because it is a private, not-for-profit entity. And I don't want to be like the guy who had a parrot and he got married. And he and his parrot were really into each other. And the parrot was kind of jealous of the fellow's wife. And so every time the fellow would leave home, the parrot would look at his wife and say, "You sure is ugly." So finally, she told her husband, she said, "You know, so you're going to have to do something with this parrot. Say, he just been molesting me, so every time you leave home, he starts calling me ugly and talking about me and stuff. And so you got to do something." So the fellow went to the parrot and said, "Look, so I know we've been buddies a long time." Said, "But you about to break up my marriage. You're going to have to cut that out now. So if you keep that up, so I'm going to have to kill you." So because I love my wife. So I've been looking for her all of my life, and she's the perfect mate. So now I'm letting her know, if you keep messing with her, I'm going to kill you. So the fellow left. His wife came downstairs, and the parrot looked at it. She said, "Go ahead, say it." So just say it. So just say it if you will. So I dare you. Parrot looked, he said, "You know." so you know. So, you know, they kind of know who's on our mind, even though we don't do no partisan, we don't do no partisan stuff, but you know, you know. But it's my pleasure to present Diane Williams, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Safer Foundation. And I didn't know that when Diane was a teenager that she lived down the street from me in the next block. And I didn't know her. I knew a lot of her girlfriends and other people, but she went to a Catholic school. And so she didn't go to the schools that they went to, and I actually taught several of her neighbors and friends, but only got to know her long afterwards. And it has just simply been a delight, because the Safer Foundation has been pioneering in this area, and they've developed some best practices that other people look at, and they've developed sort of a corporate, in a sense, approach to doing this. But what they've developed is an approach where they can clearly demonstrate results. One of the most difficult things in the world it is to do is convince people that individuals who suffer from drug addiction, for example, can actually be helped. There are a lot of people who believe that once you're an addict, you're always going to be an addict. There are people who believe that once you have been engaged in criminal activity, you will always be engaged some way, shape, form, or fashion, and that you're wasting money when you try and help individuals restore themselves and reconnect. Well, the Safer Foundation has this approach that when they get through, they can pretty much show people what they've been able to do. So, Diane, thank you so very much, and it's a pleasure.
Thank you. We can already tell that I'm not the most competent technology person. You should have seen the look of fright on my face when she changed that disc earlier on. Hello to all of you that are out there. I've been introduced, so I won't do that again. But let me start my comments by acknowledging the panel that was before us and also some of the speakers on this panel. I find great energy when I have an opportunity to hear personal stories where people have turned their lives around, sometimes with little to no support, and sometimes with support from organizations like ours. What I know is that for every person in this room, whether we have a criminal record or not, it is only by the grace of God, if we don't have one, that we don't have it. Because as we are born into this planet, and the sorts of challenges that face each and every one of us faces us as we're growing up, we don't all make perfect decisions. We don't all think that our smart aleck comments are going to land us someplace that we had no business being for any given reason. And so I just think it's important that we acknowledge those folks who are willing to come here and tell their stories. And I have to tell you, I'm often encouraged as I travel for Safer. I've been in Columbus and met people who told me how we helped their families. I've been in other cities and other states, but I've certainly been throughout the Chicago metropolitan area and encountered those kind of stories along the way. And they always give me just a little bit more energy to do a little bit more work. So thank you for that. When we think about the sort of work that we have to do at the Safer Foundation, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second, we know, though, that the people that we serve are not individuals who live in this world by themselves. No people who live in this world by themselves. And so the folks that we talk about have families, that they've been referenced earlier today. I don't want to give you a lot of numbers, but I do think it's important that we understand that the people that we serve in our organization are members of families in different roles. Sometimes they are parents, sometimes they are children, their spouses, their cousins, their brothers, their sisters, and they play all the other roles that exist. And so when we think about how we can best help them, even though our focus might really be employment, what we know is that we have to think about them in the context in which they exist, not just in a single, if you will, dimension. I'm going to do this one. We also have to think about, when we talk about reentry, who really pays for reentry? We think about the taxes that we pay when we go to work every day, and we think about how much of our taxes might go to it. We might think about the Departments of Corrections in our different states. In Illinois, they have a $1.3 billion budget each year. So we often think about those as the dollars that pay for reentry. But the truth of the matter is that the families and the communities from which people come and to which they return really pay for reentry. They are paying for it through the loss of that family member in the positive shaping of the children in their family and in their communities, and they're paying for it in the loss of dollars to their households. If you think about what goes on with that family when a person leaves home and they were probably the breadwinner of that family, we know that they're suffering for that person having to go to prison every day. And when we think about how many of those people are in prison for nonviolent crimes, we start to really shake our head about whether or not we're making good decisions. I do hope, of course, that on November 4th we'll make the right decision and we'll get a lot of support and a lot of things that we need to do. But I don't think that our decisions to incarcerate the numbers of people that we incarcerate in this country is the right decision. I know also, when I think about this, that not only do families pay and communities pay for reentry, if they are not a part of the reentry process, it won't be successful. People don't come home, again, live in the world by themselves and make themselves all okay. The way that they have the successes that they have is to have support in place to help them. Sometimes it's formal family, sometimes it's informal family, and sometimes it is organizations like ours that help to play that role. But we have to have families and communities involved in the process of designing and developing whatever kind of support is going to be put in place for people when they come home. Let's see if I do this right. So as we think about this, we think about families and communities being critical. We also know that there's no standalone sort of organization or process that works. It really takes partnerships, and it takes a, if you will, a continuity of services to help people to live the lives that they're choosing to live. And so in our organization, because we do focus on employment, we know that employment is critical to the success, but it's not the only answer to anybody's return process. Last year, 9,331 people came to SAFER and asked us for help. We helped all of those people in some way or another, but we actually were able to help 2,700 of those people find jobs. But we actually had 3,119 job starts. And so what that really means is that we had an opportunity to help people not just get the first job, but as they gain the experience, the work habits and the work ethics, but to help some of those people get the second job, which is really what we want people to be able to understand, is that when they come home and they begin this planning process that should start inside the institution, they shouldn't believe that when they walk out the door, their ultimate plan will be realized. Instead, there are a lot of steps that they may have to take before they get to that ultimate plan, and that first job may not be the ultimate job, but getting that first job and then ultimately moving on may well be the right thing for them. We believe that, again, nobody exists in a vacuum. We also believe that in order for any of our work to be effective, we have to engage community, family, we have to engage the human services arena, the corrections arena, and businesses arena. Because it's the intersection of those, if you will, concentric circles where our clients stand, and so we try to stand there with them. It is, again, a partnership and a joint effort that will allow us to be successful. Today, we operate in both institutions run by the state of Illinois. We operate in community-based institutions that we run ourselves, and we also operate, if you will, in our local offices where we help people who are already home. I mentioned the total number of people that we supported last year. Today, our curriculum is in 38 of the 39 Illinois prisons. We don't deliver that curriculum in every one of those prisons. What we did was partner with the community colleges so that those instructors that were already there could actually deliver our curriculum sort of under a licensing agreement and be able to make sure that more people had access to job readiness training before they leave those institutions, and therefore are better prepared to get jobs when they get home. You'll see a list of kinds of programs that we have under each one of these, but I think it's just important to note that we do start our programming inside the institution and work it home. When we talk about placing people in jobs, what we know is that some people who come home are ready to go to work right away, and we try to place them in permanent positions. Some people have never been to work before but have a desire to go to work and may need an incubated work experience. And so we try to provide that through something called transitional employment. We have a staffing company that contracts with for-profit organizations to fill their entry-level positions. And so we then hire, in many cases, our clients on our payroll, but contract with those companies to place them in their work sites to do the work that they need to have done. And then some of the clients that come to see us are not ready to go to work at all. They need, in fact, to have support with substance abuse treatment, finding housing, with mental health issues, with medical health issues. They need to take care of other kinds of things before they're able to think about work. And so we do have a supportive service track that will support them in connecting with organizations that provide that sort of service if we don't provide it ourselves. we have an opportunity to participate in a model that I want to share with you called Safer Return. And this is a project funded by the MacArthur Foundation. They've given us $5 million over a 3.5-year period of time in order to deliver this demonstration project. It is a project that when I talk to my colleagues around the country, they kind of salivate around. Most of the projects we have to do and the ways we have to figure out how to manage money, they just laugh at us. But this particular project, people get pretty excited about. We've identified one community in the city of Chicago called East Garfield Park. In East Garfield Park, we will have an opportunity to work with every person that comes from an Illinois prison back to that community over a 2-year period of time. So we have a 2-year enrollment period. And I don't have to tell you that this is going to have a lot of opportunity for success because it does happen to be in the best congressman's district in this country, Congressman Davis, who has always been supportive of making sure that people with criminal records have not just a second chance, but the number of chances they need to get it right. In this particular project, though, we will start to meet with people while they're inside the institution, somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 to 120 days before release. And we won't meet them by ourselves. We'll meet them with people who live in that community who have determined that they would like to be a part of that reentry process. In some cases, there are individuals that live in that community and have no other connection with this particular population. In some cases, they will be people who have criminal records, have turned their lives around, and have decided that they'd like to be mentors and to be a part of the successful reentry of people who are coming back today. So jointly, we will begin our conversations with people while they're inside the institution. That person will have an opportunity to determine whether or not they would like to participate in this program. There is nothing that mandates that they do it. The state doesn't mandate it. We obviously can't force them. We projected that about 80% of the people that we talked to would want to participate, and we thought we were projecting high. To date, 96% of the people we have talked to are asking to participate in the project. So we're a little worried, but we are determined to figure out whatever it is we need to figure out to make sure that it happens. In this model, though, the Safer Foundation does not do all things. We readily recognize that there are some things that we're good at, and there are some things that we don't know anything about. The Urban Institute, which is really the source of MacArthur wanting to fund a project like this, is the evaluation arm for this project. So as the Congressman said, we have started the design of the evaluation, of course, prior to the implementation of the project. And so we will have evaluation data when this project is complete that we hope will motivate other jurisdictions to replicate this program. Because the other thing that we did was, while it has a fairly hefty startup cost, when the startup costs are removed, the cost per participant is no more than people pay for programs today, which means they will be affordable in those communities where they want to do reentry work. So we thought it was important that we structure it that way. This particular project also has a series of different advisory groups. And I'm not going to try to take you through all of them, but to let you know that we have advisory groups around the work crews that will be developed in this model. We have advisory groups from the community and from the business world, so that as we put this work together, again, we have the support mechanisms and the outreach to hopefully sustain and continue to improve what we're doing. I think one of the most critical components of this model, though, is that we're actually developing, in conjunction with Carol Shapiro from the Family Justice Institute in New York, a family-inclusive model. Because while we, unlike Carol, where her work is all sort of family-centered, we really are primarily focused on the individual that's returning. But again, we understand that that person does not live in isolation. And so we want to have a model that we can actually implement in this particular program, but also implement throughout our other programs when people are coming home. So a model that talks to families before people return and understands where that family is and what kind of support that family needs in order to be able to be supportive to the individual coming home. Helping them to understand the experience that a person may have and the expectations that they may have when they come home, so that, again, they're better prepared to work with them. Lots of people do come home and they want the world to be perfect, and it's not. And lots of people are at home and are frustrated because that person wasn't home to help along the way. And so we just think it's important that as we work with the folks who are returning, that we also work with their families and make sure that they're connecting with the resources and the assistance that they need, so as a unit they can be successful. The concept that is sort of embedded in this particular model is something called a justice intermediary. And this, again, is a concept that comes from Jeremy Travis and the Urban Institute, which basically says that for a person to come home and have to navigate all of the systems, the neighborhoods, the peers, all the kinds of things that they have to navigate, might be asking just a little bit too much. But if, in fact, those, if you will, units are operating together already and can support that person when they come home, the opportunity for success is increased significantly. So as we look at this model, we have engaged every group that we can engage that touches this. The police are engaged in this model. The police will look at people who come to this home, to this program. They will have an identification card that lets people know that they are part of this program. If they are picked up for something, the police will call the parole officer and or the case manager with our program in order to talk about what comes next for that particular person. The Human Services departments, Department of Alcohol and Substance Abuse, Department of Mental Health, the city, from the perspective of not only their agencies for social services, but even in helping us to design work crew opportunities so that our folks can go to work on a transitional basis when they come home, are engaged in this process. And so I mentioned local businesses. The faith-based communities have always been engaged in our work, and they continue to be engaged in this model in lots of different ways, from mentoring to welcome home panels to all the different components that or roles that they can play. But again, at the center of that is client and family. I'm going to conclude my talk today just by sharing some of the numbers that we do have to share, and those are our recidivism rates. Every year, Loyola University comes in and takes a look at the people who have gone through the Safer Foundation programs in entirety. They look at every single person, not just a random sample, 3 years before. And they track those people over the course of 3 years using the same kind of measurements that our state uses when assessing recidivism. And basically, the recidivism rate for the state for people who were released in 2003, 3 years later, was about 52%. If you look at our numbers, what you'll notice that if those people were able to get both social services and have access to employment services, it drops down to 13%. So while there are also a lot of other data points out there that tell you that employment works, everything about our results tells us that employment works. And so we hope that you will continue the work that you're doing, and we look forward to answering any questions that you might have later. Thanks.
I tell you, if you can get a job, you just don't have as much time to do a whole lot of other things because you got to go to work. I mean, I remember that song that the blues singer used to sing in the 60s. You know, every morning about this time she'd bring my breakfast to the bed crying, get a job. When I read the paper, I read them through and through, trying to see if there's any work for me to do. Get a job. I mean, get a job. If you don't have a job, it's very difficult to experience the sense of fulfillment that you are connecting with the rest of your environment and somehow or another contributing to its perpetuation. And so a job is more than just working to take care of oneself. A job adds another dimension to life. And if you want a sense of self-worth, we were talking about self-worth, don't be able to get a job and see how much self-worth one can experience without the ability to just basically take care of themselves and contribute in some way. Our last presenter for this session, quite frankly, is one of the most inspirational people that I have known. And I've known a lot of inspirational people. When I met her, I was just amazed. I was inspired by her sense of dedication, by her sense of commitment to what she was working on. I was inspired by her sense of faith. Well, Addie Richburg is a mover of mountains. And every time I see her, something happens to me, and I start smiling to myself, saying how fortunate I am that I know this delightful lady. Addie.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I think my feelings for you are mutual, and I think all of us in this room owe you a great debt of gratitude for all the things that you've done and stayed the course with this really important legislation. I say to all of you this afternoon, I come to you first of all as the daughter of a former or a late pastor, raised all my life in the church. And for some of you all who understand what that means, that's church 8 days a week, 24 hours a day type of environment. And I thought I was getting away from it. And then unfortunately, I made a commitment I would never in my life look at a man if he were a preacher. That was my prerequisite for how I dated. Unfortunately, ran into and married another preacher who in this case was a federal chaplain, and who unfortunately just a few years ago at the age of 49 passed away. It was his commitment and vision after seeing the thousands of churches and religious groups that would come inside of a prison to provide Bible studies and various spiritual services, that there had to be something else and another role and some way to make the church understand that the real need began the day they left. Actually, to begin to integrate life as it would be before you leave, and to have the church standing and waiting at the bus station as opposed to the pimps and the drug dealers and whoever else might choose to show up for the occasion. And on that note, the establishment of the National Alliance of Faith and Justice, which originally was seated in the National Association of Blacks in Criminal Justice, came to bear in 2000 to try to bring the church together with a lot of the criminal justice issues. And our goals, there's so many hundreds and thousands of groups out here who've been doing wonderful work, and I acknowledge just from seeing a lot of you here in the audience, I have to point to the Sullivans sitting directly in front of me in the back, who for years have sojourned on this issue, and Gene Guerrero and Mr. Mitchell sitting next to him, who on a daily basis almost I see working on these issues. But we recognize that in the community, a lot of the churches, many storefronts, many smaller congregations, a lot of them did not understand a lot of the vital research like Diane and some of my other panelists have presented. Many weren't even technologically connected. Emails, the basic coordination of conversation by email. Many at the same time, even if they were connected from a technological standpoint of email to get access to internet and studies and research, it was just not the mechanics many times of the pastor to sit and read a research study report. We needed to see things to the pastor in a way that he or she could quickly absorb it, either delegate the responsibility, take it on as a passion, or some kind of way to connect with the information. Very much it troubled us that on a legislative standpoint, we could not seem to get the church to understand so much public policy and how there was a role without compromising the spiritual context of what you were doing with moving public policy. And so we began to try to position ourselves to absorb and digest and then translate the importance of these things to the faith community. And We began by establishing what we called the Black Church Task Force on Crime and Criminal Justice, which originally was funded through the U.S. Department of Justice, to try to convene faith groups. Leaders from 19 different faith groups came together to try to begin to understand some of the pressing areas of consideration within the criminal justice matrix. The Open Society Institute was able to help us to bring together to Washington, D.C., people who hadn't sat at the table together before, to sit down and talk about this. Now, some of us understand what I mean by that. We don't all, just because we of faith, we can't all sit at the same table. I don't know what it is, but we can't. But for one time in our life, we did. In Washington, D.C., in 2003, we all sat, Congressman Davis, many others who were working then on just the fundamentals of second chance. It wasn't even, I believe, presented at that time. Came together and talked about the intent of the legislation and what it was going to do, and if we could just get it off the ground. We found that there were religious leaders that were really interested in doing something about this, but just didn't know how. That was the famous question: how do we do it? And particularly people who weren't familiar with working with government on a federal or state or local level, or did not feel that they had a chance to, didn't understand the complicated RFP process, didn't understand how to compete for grants, certainly didn't understand how to write them, didn't understand how to find them, didn't understand, weren't willing to partner, did not want to use or could not see how to use some of the valuable resources that they had right there in the church, because the church was a community. In the church is the business owners. In the church are the people working in different areas, are the people who work in these same agencies that handle the resources. So we began to try to find a way to translate all that and begin to travel back and forth across the country, meet with larger churches, what we call mega churches in the whole faith community. We begin to work with storefront churches. Whoever will, soever will, let them come, was our motto. And with that in mind, the Annie E. Casey Foundation began to work with us to begin to put out some things that could help us put these points across in a visual context, because, you know, we like to look at stuff. We like to look at TV. We like to look at movies, etc. And so we put together a piece called "To Serve This Present Age, Reentering Through Faith." And anybody in here who is of faith understand what "to serve this present age" starts. At least I hope you do. If you don't, I'll take you back through Baptist 101 when I get through. But nonetheless, we put it together, and it revealed 5 modules: reentry, mentoring children of prisoners, disproportionate minority confinement at that time, which has since been changed to contact, partnerships and working together and collaborations, and focusing on the women was another area that we focused on. And this particular tool has been helpful to us in helping the faith community and others to understand the plight of persons returning to prison, returning from prison, returning to families, and trying to work together with others to help deal with these issues. We've also begun working over the years with the Department of Health and Human Services and the Healthy Marriage Initiative. One of our major areas of focus has been in the state of California through the church, as a matter of fact, the Western Baptist Convention. We are working very closely with them in what we call SPA 6 of what used to be South Central, which is now South LA. And working with the church, and a gentleman mentioned earlier about the connections of how do we keep youth from getting into this. I tie that with the SPA 6 issue because we've been trying to help people understand in this area how crime and criminal justice affects the marriage and the family, both before kids get into it and, of course, on the whole opposite perspective in the reentry. Another thing that we've been doing is in the faith community setting aside through trademark a date called Justice Sunday. It is the Sunday prior to the Martin Luther King federal holiday, which allows us to bring attention in churches across the country to the plights and issues that we're here today to talk about. Justice Sunday is a Sunday that allows us to, in our worship experiences, in our bulletins, in our pledges to do service the day before our continuing for that year in honor of Dr. King, to look at the issues of criminal justice. One of the strong partners that we've had at that has been the District of Columbia. Has been working with the Court Services and Offenders Supervision Agency, who began their period of reentry, usually 27, 28 days of reentry on Justice Sunday, and engage all their churches around it so that the churches will all be focused on that issue during that particular Sunday. But one of the things that we're most proud of, and we're hoping to slow down, if at all possible, one child at a time, which might be a slow process, but it's a start. We've began an initiative that allows us to look at history, our history as African Americans, and how the issues of crime and criminal justice have in fact been recreated from some of the trials and tribulations that we suffered as African Americans. The project is called Pen or Pencil. For some of you who've been here in the Congressional Black Caucus meetings prior to here, yesterday you probably heard of or at least saw a number of high school youth here. There were probably 400 youth from all kinds of school districts across the country here yesterday. PEN stands for penitentiary. Pencil stands for education, and it's the choice and the fork in the road that unfortunately many youth have to face. We've taken the terminologies of history, which unfortunately disturbed me a lot, given a background in criminal justice that I have, that some of the terms in history were applicable to the prison system today. For instance, commissary is a term used during the Jim Crow period of sharecropping. And sharecropping was one of the different methodologies of sharecropping could be looked upon and integrated into the drug culture, because that's many times what our young people are doing. They're sharecropping. Somebody else owns the plantation. They're just the person working it. And so we have taken and integrated some of these things into a very complex African American studies, social studies, civic education base, and healthy relationship education base that's been endorsed by the National Council for the Social Studies and implemented in a number of schools, 41 school districts across the country, to help kids understand that we're dealing with a new form of enslavement now, that slaves are still possible if you allow yourself to be a slave. That we believe, like Harriet Tubman, that I freed 300 slaves, and I could have freed 300 more if they knew they were slaves. We also work with the issue of, we have new slave masters today. We have drugs, we have crimes, we have violence. It works the same way. We're dealing with a much deeper element of slavery now, the psychology of slavery, which is more binding than the whole bonds and chains that anybody could have put on us years ago. So all of that is part of who we are. We take the information that comes from the Hill, translate it, send it out to churches, convene. One of our most, I can't even describe the words. One of the things that really touched our heart, I'll put it that way, a couple of weeks ago, was in convening our groups for Pen and Pencil around this issue and looking at the amount of parents who had been in jail or prison and seeing how many of our kids in that program had a parent who was in jail or prison. We found out of the 24 affiliates from NEFJ that we convened in High Point, North Carolina, you might say, why did we go there? We went there because there were so many issues of that nature that our groups needed to see. And we took them there so that they could see it. We found that out of the 24 affiliates that went there, 896 of them had put an adult with a child who had a parent in prison and could give us the name the adults that were with them, the addresses of the child, and everything. So we were really touched by that because we knew that if we can at least get to the children, perhaps before they make that critical, I think it was a 18-minute decision, the lady said on one of the panels, if we can make that transition before then, we could perhaps keep another child from becoming a slave of a vicious culture. And so, all that said, we brought some materials here today that if you'd like to have copies of them, you're welcome to them. If you have any questions, there's a whole lot more that I could say, but the one thing I would say, and this is the reality of the situation, if I asked everybody in here to raise your hand, if you are an offender, everybody in here should raise your hand. No, you may not have been in the federal system, the state system, or the county system, or the city system, but you have been an offender. I say to all of us, if it was not by God's grace, we wouldn't be here. Some of us ought to have been in jail or prison. We just didn't get caught. And some of our crimes have been more vicious than some of those who sat up here on the panel. But let's just say we'll leave it at that. So before we turn up our nose and before any of us slight ourselves or before we get too large to start doing the things we need to do to help somebody, everybody in this room has something you can do. You may not be the pastor of a church, you may not be the head of an agency, you may not be a supervisor that can hire somebody, but you have skills. Some of you have skills, and those skills should be used to help somebody else. Thank you.